Police in Ecuador violently repressed the protests held by farmers demanding a fair price for their products. Brazil's Chief Justice Luis Fux has denounced the anti-democratic practices of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro, who continues to attack the Supreme Court. Polls have closed in Morocco, where 18 million citizens were eligible to vote in regional and parliamentary elections. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is from the south. I'm Katrina Goss. We begin in Ecuador, where police violently repressed the protest held by farmers demanding a fair price for their products. Rice farmers demanded an increase in the price paid for a £200 sack of rice to $35. After blocking several roads in Guayas province as part of the demonstration, the police launched tear gas to disperse the protesters. At least one person was injured and taken to a nearby health facility. Rice producers stressed that the increase in the price of a sack of rice was a campaign promise made to the sector by the president, Guillermo Lasso. A high-level dialogue on climate action in the Americas was held this Wednesday, hosted by the government of Argentina. The one-day virtual event, co-organized by Argentina, Barbados, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama and the Dominican Republic, brought together heads of state, the private, financial and academic sectors, multilateral credit agencies and civil society organizations to collectively address their shared commitment to enhancing climate ambition. The dialogue was set to build further momentum for climate action ahead of the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, which will be held in November in the Scottish city of Glasgow. In Bolivia, forest fires are a frequent phenomenon. However, many are deliberately started, sparking calls for tougher penalties for those responsible. In 2020, more than 3 million hectares of forest were burned in Bolivia, while so far this year fires have devastated more than 600,000 hectares. According to Bolivian authorities, many of these blazes are deliberately provoked, while the penalties for arsonists are minimal. The current fine applicable per hectare burned is only 20 cents of a dollar.
In relation to the sanction in the penal code, there is jail from 2 to 6 years. Today there is no one in jail for having started fires of great magnitude because they take advantage of the abbreviated process and pay. Therefore we have to modify it. The cost is $0.2 US per hectare borne. We are talking about 1.5 Bolivianos per hectare borne. Therefore, there is not a hard sanction for this sector. For this reason, it is also convenient to modify the law of the penal code, introducing tougher and more drastic sanctions so that we do not have fires of this nature every year.
At least 12 people are missing and another 12,000 have been affected by Typhoon Monsoon, which hit the Philippines Tuesday with sustained winds of 120 and gusts of 150 kilometers per hour. Emergency authorities reported that at least 24 houses were wrecked by the typhoon, which has caused flooding and blackouts in several areas of the country's central region. The missing persons are fishermen who were working when the typhoon struck. Officials say that monsoon's damages have not been severe and it's been downgraded to a tropical storm that is expected to leave the nation on Friday. Meanwhile, Typhoon Chanthu intensified to become a Category 5 super typhoon. The storm is rapidly gaining speed and strength before striking southern China, where it's expected to arrive by the end of the week. Chanthu is packing gusts of up to 280 kilometers per hour. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Brazil's Chief Justice, Luis Fux, denounced the anti-democratic practices of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro following his repeated attacks on the Supreme Court, including incitement of violence by his supporters. Bolsonaro is on a crusade against several Supreme Court judges after the institution authorized several investigations against him and members of his inner circle.
Offending the honor of the justices, inciting the population to spread hate of speech against the institution of the Supreme Court, and encouraging non-compliance with judicial decisions are anti-democratic and illicit practices. In a mature political environment, challenges to judicial decisions should be carried out not through disobedience, not through disorder, and not through provoked chaos, but certainly through the recourses which procedural avenues offer.
A small group of President Jair Bolsonaro's supporters refused to end the protest that started on Tuesday in support of the president. Our correspondent Brian Meir brings us more from the Brazilian capital.
I'm standing in front of Brazil's Congress, where a small but vocal and aggressive group of truck drivers and other Bolsonaro supporters have camped out. They refuse to end the protest. They're saying they're going to stay for at least 24 hours, and their goal is to get rid of all 12 ministers of the Supreme Court, essentially shutting down the Supreme Court in a fascist strategy to deliver more power to far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. Earlier this morning, a group of them tried to invade the Health Ministry building and were pushed back by a few of the security officers inside. It's difficult to understand why the health minister was appointed by Jair Bolsonaro. The protesters don't really have a problem with him, but it seems like a small group of people left over from the original protests who are not from Brasilia are sticking around to try and cause as much confusion as possible.
And this Wednesday, Brazil's Supreme Federal Court resumed the trial on the so-called time frame argument, which will define the future demarcation of the country's indigenous reservations. A ruling has been postponed several times already. The argument put forward by agribusiness interests and supported by the far-right government of President Jair Bolsonaro is that in order for territory to be recognised as belonging to indigenous communities, they must be able to prove that they were physically occupying the land at the time of the promulgation of the 1988 Constitution. This ignores centuries of forced displacement of indigenous peoples from their lands and could set a precedent to strip them of even more. On Tuesday, the Congress of Colombia passed President Ivan Duque's new tax reform law, despite the mass protests against the move. After almost 10 hours of debate and with opposition representatives leaving the chamber in protest, the tax reform was approved in the Senate with 77 votes in favour and 2 against. The far-right Duque administration claimed that the bill would allow the government to grant aid to 50% of the population affected by the pandemic, but this claim was rejected by opponents who stressed it was nothing but rhetoric and that the law in fact does nothing to address the pressing needs of the population. In the lower chamber, the bill was approved with 124 votes in favour. Opposition representatives also left the session, arguing that right-wing parties did not allow any discussion of the proposal. Sunday will see primaries in Argentina ahead of the midterm elections in November. The country's different political forces are presenting their proposals for the nation's political agenda. Our correspondent Oscar Orquera brings us some of the key campaign issues presented by left-wing candidates.
The housing issue is one of the matters Frente de Izquierda, Left Front, seeks to tackle in the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, where rent for one family takes up almost half a salary.
Ahead lies the challenge of taking the left toward legislature. There are fundamental problems in the city related to jobs, healthcare, education, and housing, which basically only the left tends to. In this campaign, and I mind pointing it out, Larreta and Macrism have been governing the city of Buenos Aires for 14 years. They've privatized half the city. But they haven't done it alone. They've had help from accessories that today are in so-called opposing lists, whereas Frente de Izquierda not only says it opposes Larreta, we have done so in legislature and in the streets.
Holding a higher protagonism in the National Congress after the Green Tide that shocked the South American country is another goal.
As a leader of an organization composed by women, I represent a specific agenda that us women in this country have, and speaking for the most of them that today are being affected by the government's ongoing adjustment plans, those that have a particular toll on working class women. Then taking a seat in the National Congress for us from a united left front, that is to barge in with an agenda that offers genuine work to women, register, lawful work that could end the existing miserable wages.
The Alliance Política Obrera, Workers' Politics, seeks to solve pressing matters of health and wages and rejects any payment of foreign debt.
This mortgage that Macri left will have to be paid for by workers with the new labor reform. It will have to be paid by pensioners with the new provisional negative reform. We'll all have to pay for it, just like the monetary fund requests. These are the real things at stake in these elections. For us, Política Obrera, to be in Congress, it is to give that fight, to debate and defend wages, the right to work in a crucial time in Argentina.
The pandemic has stirred up questions in education that require urgent debate, something Política Obrera intends to see out.
Is part of the teachers' movement that has fought against the criminal presidential courts appointed by governments, which has brought upon the population health damages, because infections increase, and this, with the new virus strain, has put the health system in check. As part of this movement, I want to be in Congress to defend the interests of educational workers and of workers as a whole.
They also suggest growing into a united political sector.
The left has to change. It has to tear its own roof, reach out to the independent sectors outside the conventional parties. For us, it is important that the left front opens its door to the fighters.
COVID-19 and weather conditions make this campaign closing atypical, but this only makes the citizens' vote more sought after.
Oscar Orquera, TeleSUR, Buenos Aires, Argentina.
An historic trial is beginning in France over the 2015 Paris attacks, which left 130 people dead and hundreds more injured. The suicide bombing and gun assault by 3 teams of terrorists on bars, restaurants, Le Stade de France and the Bataclan music venue, claimed by ISIS, was the worst post-war atrocity on French territory. The only surviving attacker, Salah Abdeslam, arrived to stand trial with 13 other defendants at a purpose-built facility in central Paris. 14 of the accused, who face charges ranging from providing logistical support to planning the attacks, as well as weapons offences, are expected to be present in court. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Polls have closed in Morocco, where 18 million citizens were eligible to vote in the regional and parliamentary elections. Citizens turned out to vote for 395 members of parliament and over 31,000 local and regional officials. None of the main parties with winning options in the legislative elections presented any women candidates. There was no immediate indication of the final turnout, but around 36% of registered voters had done so by 5 p.m, according to the Interior Ministry. Full official results are not expected until Thursday. King Mohammed VI will name a prime minister from the party that leads the parliamentary poll to govern the nation of 36 million for the next 5 years. In Guinea, members of the coup movement that overthrew President Alpha Condé appointed military governors in 8 regions of the country. The military committee that seized power over the weekend pledged on Monday to establish a government of national unity and assured there wouldn't be any vengeful acts or witch hunts aimed at former officials. On the other hand, the de facto rulers released 79 political prisoners and promised to continue doing so. Leaders from the Economic Community of West African States held an extraordinary virtual summit to discuss their response to the coup in Guinea. The bloc has condemned the move, threatening to impose sanctions.
The main matter which has brought us here, which is the unfortunate and regrettable incident that has taken place in Guinea. And it is to discuss that and to discuss our response to this clear violation of our common charter of governance, of good governance in the ECOWAS region, and what decisions we want to take in response.
As part of the summit, the Economic Community of West African States announced it had suspended Guinea from the organisation's decision-making bodies and will send a team to the country on Thursday to mediate a solution to the crisis. The bloc also called on the African Union and the United Nations to support these decisions. On Wednesday, a blaze killed at least 41 inmates of an Indonesian prison. The blaze started around 3 a.m. local time in a Tangerang prison in a block that was housing prisoners convicted for drug-related offences. As well as the 41 fatalities, the fire left 72 people injured, according to prison authorities. Indonesia's justice minister said police had started identifying victims, but that DNA testing would probably be needed for some of the bodies. Authorities were still investigating the cause of the incident at the prison, located just outside the capital, Jakarta, but suspected an electoral had been to blame. The prison's electrical system had not been upgraded since it was built over 40 years ago in 1972, and the facility was overcrowded. The fighting in Yemen has intensified in the northern city of Marib, nearly 7 years into a war that has triggered a major humanitarian crisis. Nearly 80 members of the Houthi movement and troops of the Saudi-backed government have been killed in the latest clashes, according to officials. Scores of Houthis were killed in airstrikes after they resumed their attempt to capture the strategic city of Marib, the internationally recognised government's last outpost in the north. Meanwhile, the largest humanitarian crisis in the world rages on, sparked by the Saudi Arabian-led military intervention in 2015. The World Health Organization has called for countries to avoid giving out extra COVID jabs until the end of the year, highlighting that millions of people worldwide have still not received a single dose.
Today, I'm calling for an extension of the moratorium until at least the end of the year, to enable every country to vaccinate at least 40% of its population. Globally, 5.5 billion vaccine doses have now been administered, but 80% have been administered in high and upper middle income countries. WHO's global targets remain to support every country to vaccinate at least 10% of its population by the end of this month, at least 40% by the end of this year, and 70% of the world's population by the middle of next year. Almost 90% of high-income countries have now reached the 10% target, and more than 70% have reached the 40% target. Not a single low-income country has reached either target.
Its commitment to deliver impartial and independent humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. UN's Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths met with the Taliban leadership in Kabul to reiterate the humanitarian community's commitment to deliver impartial and independent aid and protection to millions of Afghans in need. Referring to the Taliban, a UN official said the group had pledged to guarantee the safety and security of humanitarian staff and humanitarian access to people in need, while humanitarian workers will be guaranteed freedom of movement.
Nearly half of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance. 18 million people, generally speaking, need some kind of humanitarian protection assistance. 14 million need food, 9 million need access to water, 600,000 have been internally displaced this year alone, and 5 million people remain displaced from previous years.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many of our stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.